Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be a little bit different. As you can see from the title, I am deviating a little bit from my usual fantasy fare. And today I wanted to tell you about my 10 favorite non-fantasy books. I've talked a lot on the channel about how the channel came into being, why I started to do this. And a lot of it was that over the years I had fallen out of reading adult fantasy, and I was not at all up to date on what was new, what was popular, what was good, and I really missed reading fantasy. As someone who grew up exclusively reading fantasy, I really wanted to get back into it. And a lot of the people that I had found on BookTube were reading fantasy and talking about fantasy. So it became this great avenue to discuss and discover. And I have had such a good time. However, I have never taken a break from reading. I have always read at about the same pace, read the same number of books per year. It's just that I wasn't reading fantasy. And even though I have focused my reading a little bit more on fantasy over the past 6 months or so, I still tend to read pretty widely, and I have a number of favorite books that are outside the fantasy genre. I know that many of us sometimes want to go outside and read something a little bit different, and I thought it might be nice to take this opportunity to talk about 10 of my favorite books that are outside of the fantasy realm. These are not in any particular order. I would find it really difficult to rank them in that way, especially since a lot of my all-time favorites are within fantasy, so things are a little bit, pushed around, and I'm just going to kind of go from 10 to 1, but don't assume that the number 10 spot is my least favorite up to my very favorite. It's just this is the order that I thought of them in, and I'm going to go from there. A lot of these have probably made an appearance on the channel in the past, whether it's in if you like this, then try this, or some other recommendations video, maybe in some wrap-ups or something like that, although I think there's only one book that I've read this year that made the top 10 list. But if you are interested, then please stick around for the list of books. Coming in at number 10 is On Writing by Stephen King. So this is a book that I have talked about a lot in some of my collaborative videos, and then also on the channel. It was in my video of best books for people who would like to write fantasy. And essentially it is just a memoir that is written by Stephen King. It talks about his experiences as an author. It gives advice for people who want to write, and it just talks a little bit about his life. And it's funny because I'm not a big autobiography person. I don't tend to go out of my way to read them, even if they're people that I'm really interested in. I probably have only read a handful in my life, but this one, On Writing, is just one of my favorite books ever. I have read it a bunch of times. I find the information that's in there to be really valuable, and I think that Stephen King is just a particularly compelling person. I really love his books, I love his writing style, and I liked getting to know more about him. If you are interested in finding out what his prose style or how his books read, but you're a little bit nervous to start any of his other books, then you could definitely give this a try. If you're interested in the fantasy genre, he talks a lot about fantasy / horror, talks about some of the books that have been inspirations for him, and he was a big fantasy reader as well in his earlier life. So I think that there's a lot that you can get out of this book, and it's just a pleasure to read. It was so easy to get through, and I had such a good time when I was reading it. So it definitely is one of the books that I have reread the most often, and I just get that sense of comfort and familiarity when I think about it, and that is what put it on to this list. Number 9 is kind of a totally different direction. So this book is called Landline by Rainbow Rowell. So Rainbow Rowell is a writer of contemporary young adult, which is probably one of the genres that I read the least, and also adult romance, which I do read some adult romance sometimes as my version of a palate cleanser between heavier books, but I haven't been reading a lot lately. But Rainbow Rowell's style of writing I find really appealing. I think that she has a very easygoing, almost conversational writing style. She focuses a lot on characters, and she always writes a lot about the impact of mental illness on characters. And I think she does a really good job of doing that. That's something that I always like to see in books because it connects to what I do for a living. And so I always like to see well-written characters that grapple with some of those things that I spend a lot of my time talking to other people about. This particular book, Landline, does have a bit of a supernatural edge to it, so I don't know if it's breaking the rules a little bit. But essentially, we have a woman who is married to her college sweetheart. They have 2 kids together, and their relationship is kind of falling apart. The woman is a workaholic. The husband is a stay-at-home dad. She is away from the house too much. He feels resentful. And the dad and the 2 kids end up going away for the Christmas holidays, and the mom, the main character, decides not to go because she's writing a television pilot and she's really close to having this pilot picked up, and so she decides not to go with her family on vacation. And this causes a rift between her and her husband. She's not sure what the status of their relationship is or what's going to happen. And so she goes to her mom's house. And while she's there, she calls her husband on the old landline that she used to use to talk to him when they were in college. And she finds out as she calls him that this phone is actually connecting to him in the past during a part of their relationship in college where they had broken up. And she's realizing that she needs to get him from the point where they had broken up in college to when they reconciled. And then she has to grapple with the idea of if she even wants to do that. Was their relationship overall positive? What kind of impact do they have on each other's lives? What does it, mean for her, for them, if he doesn't decide to forgive her and the relationship goes through? And I thought it was a really interesting spin on a romance novel. Rainbow Rowell is really funny. I always really like the humor between her characters. I think she would make an excellent writer for TV because she does very good one-liners. There's a lot of quips. I think she's very witty. And like I said, this is just, again, like with On Writing, this is a comfort read for me. I reread it every couple of years. And it's always easy for me to flick through, and I just find it overall to be very heartwarming and with a message that we can sometimes forget, especially for people who, like myself, can be very focused on particular tasks like work and can get lost in that. And I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on the channel either, but my husband is a stay-at-home dad and I'm gone a lot for work. So I feel like there's a lot to identify with there. And there are some very particular struggles that come out of that and some emotions that you need to navigate. So I really like that book. For me, it always makes me come out of there feeling hopeful and happy. So that is a book that I really enjoy. Number 8 is a middle grade book, actually. So this is a contemporary middle grade, which again is not a genre that I read often, but there are a couple that have been particularly hard-hitting and have stayed with me for a long time. This one I read for the first time, I don't even know when. I'm not even really sure when it came out, but I feel like it must have been at least 10 years ago. And it is called The Absolutely True Diary of a Part-Time Indian by Sherman Alexie. So Sherman Alexie is of Aboriginal heritage. He's from the United States. And this middle grade novel, I believe, is somewhat semi-autobiographical. It is fiction, but I think it was heavily influenced or inspired by his own life. And we follow a young boy who grows up on a reservation, and he is very, very bright, but also ostracized by most of his peers because he had hydrocephalus as a baby. So he's got a really big head, he's had multiple brain surgeries, is not really able to be boisterous or rambunctious, and he's very quiet and bookish. So he really loves to read, and he really loves learning. And so he feels like he wants something more while also feeling very tied to his heritage, very tied to his people. And what happens is that he gets the opportunity to go off the reservation and study in a school surrounded mainly by white children. And so he has to make that decision to go and kind of attain a level of education that he otherwise wasn't able to attain. and how that feels sometimes like a betrayal to his family, to himself, and feeling like he doesn't really fit in between either one of these worlds. And I think it talks about a lot of really heavy topics. It does not pull any punches in terms of the things that can happen to a kid in this kind of situation. So it definitely has a level of emotional maturity that surpasses a lot of the middle grade that I have read, but it is so good. It is a love letter to books. The character obviously loves books. I'm assuming the author also really loves books. It's very funny. There are little doodles and illustrations. The main character in the book wants to become a graphic artist or a graphic novelist, and so he illustrates his own life, and it's just a very sad but charming and heartwarming story, and I really love it. I have read it a bunch of times. I got my mother-in-law to read it and she really liked it, and though I don't think they're ready for it yet, at some point I will pass it on to my kids as well and get them to read it, because I think that it is a really good story. So I really, if you are at all interested in middle grade, then I would definitely recommend checking that out. Number 7 is a book that gets talked about a fair bit, a book that gets talked about a fair bit on BookTube, and that is Beartown by Frederick Bachman. So this is one of the newer books on this list. This is one that I have read relatively recently. I think it may have come out in like maybe 2016 or 15, 17. I'm not sure. It's been within like the last few years anyway. And I had read it, I think as a recommendation from my sister-in-law upon its release. And it is a work of contemporary fiction that follows teenagers in the town of Beartown who are involved with the local hockey team in some way. So there is a young woman who is the daughter of the hockey team's coach, and she comes forward with an allegation of sexual assault against one of the star players. And this puts the entire town into an uproar. Beartown is a very downtrodden, rural kind of town where there's really nothing for people to pin their hopes on outside of this adolescent hockey team, which gets excellent results. And so you see the conflict between this young woman who has come forward, the members of the team, her father who is the coach, the other adults in the town, and it's really hard-hitting contemporary drama, essentially. I tend to like stories that revolve around sports. I was very actively involved in sports growing up, and I like to see how people portray that really intense atmosphere that can be around competitive sports, even at a high school level. I think that sports can do a lot of good, and I think there's also the potential for a lot of harm, both of which we see all the time in our own lives, in the media, everywhere essentially. So this is a really lovely story. I enjoy Frederick Bachman's writing a lot. His books tend to be somewhat hit or miss for me. He can veer too far into the sentimental for me, and then I just feel I'm not really one for that kind of overly sentimental contemporary fiction. But I think that Beartown really toes that line of sentimentality and drama, and I really like that about it. So I have read, I think, most of his books that are published, and this is by far my favorite. Beartown is actually the first of a series. The second book is released, and I think the third book is going to come out sometime this year, so I'm really excited about that because I really want to read it. Moving up the list to number 6, I think. I'm just going to glance at my list here. Yes, number 6 is a contemporary young adult novel, and that is Anna and the French Kiss by Stephanie Perkins. This is a book that gets a lot of hate on BookTube, which I can totally understand. It was really popular, I don't know, like 10 or so years ago when it came out. And for me, it has just become like the ultimate comfort novel. When we were still flying on airplanes and not limited to this island and not able to leave, it is always the book that I would read when I was flying because I am terrified of flying. I have nightmares like for the week leading up to flying. I cannot stand it, but I love to travel. So it's you know, I get on the plane and that's what I tell myself is important, but I always make sure to bring a comfort book with me. And without a doubt, those 3 comfort books are always a Harry Potter book, usually Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, The Hobbit, and Anna and the French Kiss. They're just books that I can completely get lost in. I don't have to pay that much attention to. It doesn't take a lot of mental effort for me to read through them. They're so familiar that I can just get lost in them and kind of read them over and over again. But the premise behind this book is that there is a young girl named Anna who is in, I think, her final year of high school, and her father registers her to go overseas and attend the American school in Paris. So she moves to Paris for the year, and when she moves there, she befriends a young man named Etienne St. Clair, and she falls in love with him. Unfortunately, he has a girlfriend, and so they try to be friends, and we just follow their friendship as they develop feelings for each other. And this is obviously the topic that a lot of people don't like, which I can totally see, but I really don't think that the novel glorifies any kind of unfaithful behavior. I think that it's just a natural part of adolescent relationships, is the forging and then the falling apart and trying to develop the skills in order to carry out those really difficult actions. You know, when you've been with someone and you need to end that relationship, but it is very difficult to do so. I can definitely empathize, having been an adolescent who has had to navigate some of those really difficult situations where you become really good friends and then you need to go in different directions. And it is, I think, a topic that doesn't really get talked about a lot because it is hard to talk about, because nobody likes thinking about those kinds of situations. But I just find that overall the novel captures a part of adolescence that can be very difficult and very trying. And I think that Stephanie Perkins did a good job with that. I really like her style. It's very simple. The prose is very simple, but again, it's that kind of snappy, quippy dialogue. And it's just a comfort book. If I picked it off the shelf today and read it for the first time, I probably wouldn't even think twice about it. But that's the magic of reading books at certain times in your life. They mean different things to you at different times. And this one has just become so embedded that it is that familiar comfort for me. But that is all for that one. Number 5 is a book that I have talked about, and this is actually a work of science fiction, and that is Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. I don't know how much I've talked about Margaret Atwood on the channel, but she is one of my very favorite Canadian authors. I have not even come close to reading all of her books because she has a lot, but I have read a fair number of them. I have enjoyed to loved all of them. There's kind of a spectrum there, but I have always had a good time reading her books. Oryx and Crake is by far my favorite of the ones that I have read, and it is a sci-fi / dystopian novel. So we follow our main character, whose name is Jimmy, or Snowman, and he is living in a post-apocalyptic world, and we are trying to discover what has happened, and that happens through a series of flashbacks where we find him having interactions with people from his past, and how this little trio, so it's the main character Jimmy and then a young woman and a young man who are part of his past, and we see how their lives were intertwined and what brought them from the place they were up to how the world is today. It talks a lot about climate change, it talks a lot about bioengineering and all those types of topics. And I think Margaret Atwood just has a very keen and sharp mind. She's an excellent writer. This is, I don't know if this is one of her more critically acclaimed works, but it is definitely one of the most heavily speculative of her works. And I just really enjoy her as an author. So if you like post-apocalyptic fiction, if you like dystopian fiction, if you like literary science fiction, then I would definitely recommend giving this one a try. I really should have brought some water so that I could drink something while I was doing this. Number 4 is, we're going to shift gears again into the realm of literary fiction. And this book is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. I've never talked about this book on the channel. Literary fiction is always a little bit tricky to summarize because it's usually just people interacting and doing things, like living life or suffering because of the despairs of life. But we follow a main character who is an aging rock star, someone who is past his prime, and a circle of people who interact with him. So we have kind of record executives, we have agents, and there are people kind of all across the globe whose lives tangentially intersect with one another. This book, when I read it for the first time, I was really invested for a number of reasons. So I've talked a lot about on the channel how I am an absolute sucker for nostalgia. If an author can capture a sense of wistfulness or a sense of nostalgia for times past, then I will usually end up loving that book. And there's another book on this list that I believe captures that feeling really well. But it's something that always appeals to me. I do not like, as I said before, when it becomes trite or kind of swimming in sentiment. I like things to feel authentic and realistic, but also have that touch of kind of wistful sadness that can happen as your life changes and you go through different stages. And this book touches on that idea really well. It's all about aging and life circumstances changing. Jennifer Egan's writing is very sharp. I really, really enjoy her style. And there was a lot of kind of creative chances that were taken in this book. For example, part of the end of the book takes place completely through a PowerPoint presentation on each of the pages. So she made some very bold authorial choices as she was writing this, and I think that they really paid off. I believe this book won the Pulitzer. I'm not entirely sure. It might have been the National Book Award. I am not sure. If that means something to you, it doesn't really tend to guide what I am or am not going to read. But I know some people really like to know that. But it is a fantastic book. I really, really enjoyed it. And if you like literary fiction, then I would certainly recommend giving this one a try. After this is the only book that is on the list that made it from the books that I have read this year. And I just loved it so much that I now do count it amongst some of my favorites of all time. And this is an author that I already knew that I really loved. And that book is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. So I have read a few books by John Steinbeck. I've read The Grapes of Wrath. I've read Of Mice and Men. I've read Cannery Row. And now I have read East of Eden. And East of Eden, I really, really loved. I've talked about it. I think I talked about it once before on the channel, but essentially East of Eden is a retelling of the book of Genesis. It is the story of Cain and Abel retold through a modern lens and takes place in California, in the Salinas Valley. And it's kind of an intergenerational family story that touches on a couple of different families who live out their lives there. And I think John Steinbeck thought of it as his magnum opus, as his one book, the book that he felt like he was put on the earth to write. And it is such a great experience to read it. It's a thick book, but it does not feel like it takes any time to read. The writing is really, really beautiful. I really like John Steinbeck's writing. I find it to be very crisp and clear and resonant, but very accessible, very easy to read. Stylistically, if you're reading authors from that same time period, there are some really well-known authors whose style is much denser, which can also be rewarding in its own way. But I think that the ease and the fluidity of John Steinbeck's writing really makes it easy to connect to his stories and connect to his characters. But this is, I cannot praise this book enough. If you are at all interested in reading classics or modern classics, then I think you have to read East of Eden. Of the books by John Steinbeck I have read, it is my favorite, but I would count all of his books amongst my favorites because I just really like them. I think that he was a phenomenal author, and I will definitely, over the course of my life, make my way through his entire backlist. But East of Eden was the one that I had to choose to put on this list. And this just leaves us with two, I believe. Yes, so the final two are books that I have definitely talked about on the channel before. Coming in at number 2 is Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. So Murakami is a bit of a strange author. He writes a lot of magical realism, a lot of really strange and wondrous books. And Norwegian Wood, I think, from what I understand, is probably the most straightforward of his novels. We follow a university student as he is interacting with several people in his life. Again, with literary fiction, it's a little bit hard to explain exactly what the plot is, but just like with A Visit from the Goon Squad, in Norwegian Wood, through the eyes of the main character, we get to experience some of that nostalgia, some of that sadness for times in your life that have passed, people who have passed on through your life. We get a lot of the kind of existential angst and the emotional angst of the main character as he interacts specifically with a young woman with whom he has a relationship. And it is so beautifully written. It makes me wish that I could read this book in its original Japanese, because if translated, Haruki Murakami's writing is this beautiful. I can't imagine what it's like in his native language. There are sentences from this book that have stuck with me in all of the years since I have read it, and I have never reread this book. It just made a huge impact on me after having read it one time. And there are still lines from the book that I remember word for word because they had such a big impact. So I think if you have tried a book by Murakami and you thought that it was a little bit too weird or wonderful for you, this one is much more straightforward. It does play with timeline a little bit, and it can be, I think, purposefully hazy, but in that kind of looking through to the past kind of way, not in a I don't understand what's going on, what is this kind of way. But I really, really enjoyed it. I would like to read more of Murakami's work. So if you have a particular favorite of his, if you've read any of his other books and you really recommend them, then I would definitely like to give some of them a try. I think the only other one that I own is the Wind Up Bird Chronicles, but I would be willing to try others as well if anybody has any particular suggestions. The very last book on this list, and one of my personal favorite books of all time. I know these are all my favorites, but I've done a bunch of different favorite lists. This one would always make the favorites of all time list if I was including all genres. And that is The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. I really like Hemingway's style. Again, I haven't read anywhere close to his full bibliography. I have read The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms and The Old Man and the Sea, all of which I really loved, but The Sun Also Rises was by far my favorite. The ending line of The Sun Also Rises is my favorite ending line, probably my favorite line ever in literature. I had made like a little infographic, and it was like the background of my computer all through university. I really enjoy Ernest Hemingway's sparse writing style. This book follows a group of expat American friends who are living together in Europe after World War I. I think is it World War I or World War II? I think it's after World War I. And they are all living together, and it's just about their lives, and it's about that kind of lost generation that, following the Great War, people searching for meaning, searching for how to go on with their lives, what it meant to be alive, being burdened with that survivor's guilt. And it is just a phenomenal book. I really, really love it. It's not going to be for everyone. I know that there are lots of people who don't identify with that style of writing, who don't really enjoy the way that Ernest Hemingway writes characters. There are some artistic choices that he makes that are probably not for everybody, but I always, always really love his books. This, again, has that sense of quiet despair that so often is infused with also the happiness of life. And I think that it's important to experience all of those emotions, that whole range of emotions, when we get stuck in only ever wanting to feel happiness or joy. I think that actually leads to a lot of dissatisfaction, because we need to recognize that life is kind of a whole host of emotions. And I fall particularly hard for the books that focus on those really tough situations. So I really love The Sun Also Rises. I read it for the first time, I think, in my first year of university, this really old, beaten up copy of my dad's where all of the pages were falling out, and have gone on to buy several other copies that I really enjoy and love. And it is, like I said, one of my favorite books of all time. But that's it. Those are 10 non-fantasy books, 10 of my favorite non-fantasy books. I would love to hear from any of you who also read outside of fantasy. What are some of your favorite books? Is there a particular genre that you really love reading? I hope that this was enjoyable. I know it's very outside the usual content, but I thought that it might be nice to talk about some of these books that otherwise don't get a lot of airtime on the channel. So please let me know some of your favorites, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!